I believe we are ready to go. A unique setting, and I want to welcome our witness, even though at my advanced age, I'm not, as Rick was saying earlier, we think you're there. We can almost see you in the distance. Appreciate you wearing the bright color to help us with that. So this is our first hybrid hearing. I'm quite confident this will work out just fine. I appreciate the members who are here. We have members who are participating remotely as well. I have a statement up front that will explain the process, and then we'll proceed with a normal hearing. So I'd like to welcome members who are joining today's proceeding remotely. Those members are reminded that they must be visible on screen within the software platform for the purposes of identity verification when joining the proceeding, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and if necessary, voting. Will not be necessary today. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on for the entirety of the time they attend the proceeding. These members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short period for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin it if they return. If a member who is participating remotely experiences technical difficulties, please contact the committee staff for assistance and they will help you get reconnected. When recognized, video of remotely attending members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via the television/internet feeds. Members participating remotely are asked to mute their microphone when they are not speaking. Doing so will help to ensure that the remote technology works properly. Members participating remotely will be recognized normally for asking questions, but if they want to speak at another time, they must seek recognition verbally. In all cases, members are reminded to unmute their microphone prior to speaking. Members should be aware that there is a slight lag of a few seconds between the time you start speaking and the camera shot switching to you. To account for this, please do a brief preamble in your remarks before you, or you can just pause and wait for a second. You don't have to actually prepare a preamble, I don't believe. Members are also advised that I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceeding. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, remotely participating members should see a 5-minute countdown clock on the software platform's display, but if necessary, I will gently remind members when their time is up. Thank you very much. I appreciate, as I said, folks being here. I certainly appreciate Undersecretary Lord appearing. As all of us have tried to figure out across the country, what can we do, what can't we do, what can we do safely, how do we do it in a way that respects the very real public health crisis that we are facing and still enables us to do our job. And I will say that the Department of Defense has been very cooperative in that. We've done a number of remote informal committee events during the course of this pandemic. Undersecretary Lord has participated in, I think, at least one of those, if not more, and that has been very helpful. And it is good to have witnesses here in person. And the subject of today's hearing is to discuss the department's response to the pandemic and specifically the efforts, and as the Undersecretary for Acquisition, you are in the middle of this, the efforts to ramp up production necessary to meet that aspect of the public health challenge. And very early on, it was obvious that when we were going to have such a massive increase in public health demand surrounding COVID-19, one of the things that was going to be required was to mass produce far greater quantities of certain key public health needs than we would normally have. We have a global supply chain. That presented enormous challenges. There are many examples of that, but for instance, for the testing capacity, swabs are enormously important. A good chunk of those happen to be made in northern Italy, which created a significant challenge. So we had to adjust. And I will say, it's awkward because we have a witness here who I know has worked very hard on this issue. I've been in communication with her going back months now, and she understood this right up front, the importance of it. I do think overall, the administration and DoD was slow to respond, and there are still challenges going forward. We needed to figure out how to produce things more quickly, and from the very start, and the Undersecretary and I spoke about this, Nobody understands how to do that better than the Department of Defense. In the United States of America, certainly in the public sector, nobody procures more equipment of a varied kind and has a deeper industrial base than the Department of Defense. And I felt very strongly that early on they should get involved. I realized that as a public health crisis, the lead agencies were HHS and FEMA, but they clearly did not have the capacity that DoD did. DoD has gotten involved through the Defense Production Act and other ways, and that's a positive. I hope in the future we will understand that needs to happen as soon as possible. And we saw this coming in the January, February timeframe. Now, with that said, we've learned a lot as we've gone forward. I mean, early on, there was a huge focus on producing more bed capacity. We set up a number of field hospitals in a number of places. In a lot of cases, it didn't turn out that a lot of those were needed. So we learned as we went. But the two big areas that have been a challenge are, one, testing. And in that area, belatedly, we have started to have some success. As I believe the president was just up in Maine visiting a production facility there, which if I have my numbers correct, is cranking out 40 million swabs a month. And that is a remarkable increase and absolutely necessary to the challenge in front of us. The one big area where we still have a significant gap, believe it or not, is in personal protective equipment. And the response to that has been very frustrating. We have now sort of created this sort of global competition where states and localities and everybody is competing to track down PPE in the global marketplace. 50 states competing against each other, the federal government competing with them, all manner of different nations and other folks competing against each other. And that's made it difficult. And I have my own state's example. But we very early on recognized this, and we have managed to, frankly, leverage some relationships with companies in the area. Microsoft, Amazon have been helpful to reach out to partners around the world to get some of that product, but it still does not appear to be very coordinated. In fact, I received a letter just this week from our governor about a lot of the equipment that has come in from different places, a lot of the PPE that has come in doesn't work. It has not panned out the way we expected it to. And I am still concerned that we do not have the domestic production capacity necessary to meet the need. As we saw with the example of the swabs, we can crank up production. And that was the conversation that I was having in early March. Well, look, we don't do that. We only produce this many, and that's true, all right? But we're pretty big, pretty powerful, have a lot of money. We can change, okay? You can say, well, gosh, it's impossible. There's no way we can produce 100 million masks a month. Well, what if we did this, okay? What if the full force of the federal government came in and said, this is what you're going to build. If we need this machine, if we need this material, we'll find it and we'll make it happen. That took too long in my view, and I still am worried on the PPE side that we are not producing sufficient number of masks to meet the needs and demand. I mean, it is a basic point. What we're struggling with in our state is nursing homes, as every place is, just to get there and make sure that they have a dependable source of masks. And I'm not sure of the statistic, but I believe at one point it was between a third and 40% of the people who have died in this country from COVID-19 were in nursing homes. It is clearly the vulnerability. Now, exactly what type of mask we need for depending on the setting, we can have that debate, but what I want to see is us ramp up our production capacity. Last thing quickly, apologize, I haven't done this in a while, so I've got a lot to say, as we are trying to figure out how these contracts went out, there have been a number of disturbing stories about, business people coming along and say, hey, I can get you 30 million masks. So they get a contract and produce nothing. That money seemed to go out in a very confusing way. And even within there's $1 billion that was specifically given to DoD to manage Defense Production Act steps. I'm curious how that money is being spent. One thing that really stood out for me was apparently $100 million has gone to the foreign direct investment, which is something I've worked on with Congressman Yoho. We just expanded their ability to take equity stakes, but it's for international development. They provide loans to developing countries. What are they doing with $100 million of DPC money to send out loans to domestic companies? It didn't really make any sense. So I am still worried about whether or not we are using the full force and power of the federal government to meet this crisis, particularly when it comes to producing PPE, and to make sure that we bring the competence to the problem that is necessary. No doubt, this is a huge, complicated, difficult problem that would have been really hard to anticipate in all of its varied forms. The idea that we could have a pandemic certainly was out there. The specifics of it, that's difficult. But we are supposed to be the best. We're supposed to be able to do difficult things. And it's still very important. The disease has not gone away, and there's a lot more work to be done. And with that, I will yield to Mr. Ranking Member Thornberry for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join in welcoming Undersecretary Lord and thanking her for participating in today's hearing. Not only is the substance of what we have before us today important, this is an important trial run because this is the same room we will use to have our full committee markup in just a few weeks' time. So I appreciate her being here. And I would have to say, from my perception, well, two things. One is, Undersecretary Lord has had a lot on her plate. Chairman just described a whole range of things related to medical equipment and so forth, the Defense Production Act, DoD's role in that, as well as the supply chain for everything that DoD has to have to support our men and women of the military. At a time when a pandemic has basically shut down most all of the economy, and at a time when we are much more sensitive to foreign sources that be a part of our supply chain. And I would say, from my standpoint, kind of looking at it, I think certainly Undersecretary Lord and much of the department has done a pretty good job in dealing with unprecedented circumstances with technology that makes lots of noises, just like we've just been hearing. I think there's no question we still have challenges to work our way through. We'll talk about some of those today. But I really appreciate the effort and the success in dealing with all of those issues, the medical stuff, the Defense Production Act, the whole supply chain for everything that DoD, actually the men and women who serve, require. I hope on the other side of this, what we can also do is step back and look at changes that we can make or that the department can make to procure things faster. There are some lessons, not just with pandemics and medical-related things, but the world is changing quickly. Technology changes quickly. We have to be faster. And I think some of the challenges related to COVID should help inform us as far as acquisition, sustainment, and things moving forward. And it may be challenges of a completely different kind, but we need to learn those lessons and institute them. So again, I appreciate you being here and look forward to your testimony and the questions beyond.
Thank you. Undersecretary Lord.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on matters related to the department's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. While COVID-19 has had an unprecedented impact on the nation, under Secretary Esper's leadership, the Department of Defense has contributed immensely to the administration's whole-of-government response. Today, I will describe key elements of how the acquisition enterprise has supported other federal agencies and the Defense Industrial Base, or DIB. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted critical shortfalls in the medical supplies and personal protective equipment supply chain. On March 18, President Trump invoked the Defense Production Act. In doing so, he delegated authority to the Secretary of Health and Human Services to determine nationwide priorities and allocation of health and medical resources for responding to the spread of COVID-19. Accordingly, the DoD has been supporting HHS to execute DPA authorities. On March 27, the President signed the CARES Act. It includes language and resources to mitigate critical shortfalls and to create and expand domestic industrial base capabilities. The DoD, in support of HHS and FEMA, initiated several projects to support approximately $210 million worth of medical equipment investment. The CARES Act also provides authorities and resources to HHS to invest in industrial expansion. DoD has been providing acquisition assistance to HHS to acquire medical resources and expand industrial capacity and manufacturing throughput. Our collaboration also supports the HHS strategy to replenish and modernize the strategic national stockpile. To ensure the department was postured to leverage all of its resources, I created the COVID-19 Joint Acquisition Task Force, or JATF. The JATF team has created processes to enable HHS and FEMA to quickly and effectively access the DoD acquisition workforce, its expertise, and authorities. The JATF's work with HHS has evolved to its current support to HHS in expanding and replenishing the stockpile, as well as expanding the domestic manufacturing base for some of those items. In order to decrease our dependence on foreign suppliers for medical resources, DoD has focused on increasing domestic industrial capacity and capabilities. To that end, we executed some $284 million in industrial expansion efforts during the first 2 weeks of May 2020. The JATF is in close coordination with HHS regarding replenishment of the stockpile, reconstituting domestic production or creating new production that shifted offshore years ago often requires capital equipment expenditures, retooling, and retraining of the workforce. While the JATF is focused on sharing the DoD's acquisition expertise with HHS and FEMA, the Defense Logistics Agency has supplied badly needed medical supplies. DLA has obligated over $752 million through the end of May to provide life-saving medical supplies. I would like to highlight that this support includes an ongoing effort to supply nearly 15,000 nursing homes with a 2-week supply of PPE. I'd now like to turn to issues surrounding the DIB, including actions we have and are taking to ensure DIB viability. We are using $688 million of CARES Act funding to address impacts to the DIB by directly offsetting financial distress and providing investments to regions most severely impacted. These investments will sustain essential domestic industrial-based capabilities and spur local job creation. The Industrial Base Council has prioritized risks to address the use of this funding. Newly identified issues are continually coming in, and the IBC will continue to prioritize efforts for execution. Another area where we will be supporting the DIB is by making Defense Production Act loans through the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC. Mr. Chairman, I just have a few more minutes. I notice I'm at 5 minutes. May I take 2 or 3 more minutes? Thank you. Funds will support HHS strategic national stockpile priority areas, specifically N95 respirators, other personal protective equipment, pharmaceuticals, ventilators, airway management consumables, and testing supplies. We've also taken more immediate and direct action to support the DIB by implementing congressional direction, empowering the contracting workforce, and ensuring a healthy DIB through continued guidance and direction. We have taken steps to ensure the widest dissemination of guidance to the contracting community. These policy documents focus on allowing companies to continue to work while maintaining workforce safety, providing liquidity, implementing legislation beneficial to industry, improving speed of contracting, and providing spending transparency. In the early stages of the pandemic, the department increased the progress payment rate from 80 to 90% for large businesses and from 90 to 95% for small businesses. This change will infuse an estimated $3 billion in cash to all levels of the DIB. Further, the department has partnered with the major primes to ensure this increase in cash makes its way throughout the supply chain. As you know, Section 3610 of the CARES Act allows agencies to reimburse contractors for payment associated with the preservation of workforces prevented from working due to COVID-19 facility closures or other restrictions. Our implementation guidance provides a framework for contracting officers to assess any claimed allowable paid leave, including sick leave, that a contractor or their subcontractors provide to keep their employees in a ready state. It is important to note that Section 3610 authorized, but did not appropriate, the funds needed to make these reimbursements. While the department may be able to use other appropriated funds to reimburse contractors, the cost for 3610 is likely well beyond the department's resource ability to do so without significantly jeopardizing modernization or readiness. For example, just one of our major primes estimates that 3610 impacts could be up to $1.5 billion for their company and their associated suppliers. Section 3610 leave costs are just one category of COVID-19 related costs being experienced by the DIB. Others include those associated with contracting officer direction, such as a stop work, the purchasing of PPE, cleaning and sterilization costs, impacts related to implementing Centers for Disease Control guidance, such as spacing out factory floor activity, and the costs associated with schedule delays emanating from the supply chain. As with Section 3610, the department does not have the funding to cover these costs. The same prime contractor noted earlier estimates these non-3610 COVID-19 related costs to be in excess of $1.5 billion. Correction, to be in excess of $1 billion. The department's response to COVID-19 addresses a full spectrum of needs. I am incredibly proud of the department's response to this national emergency and to our dedicated individuals who have worked so diligently on behalf of the American people. With that, I look forward to answering your questions, and many, Mr. Chairman, that you mentioned in your opening, I'm very interested in discussing. Thank you.
Certainly, thank you very much. I guess as a starting point, on the swabs, one of the very reassuring things is to hear that they're producing 40 million a month. We have a quantifiable figure, and that's not far off from what we need. If there's more, obviously. I don't have a similar number in N95 masks. I've asked this question before, and don't have an answer. How many N95 masks are we now producing a week, a month, however you want to categorize it in this country? Where did we come from, and where do we want to get to? And I'll get to sort of the international piece in a second, but domestic U.S. production.
So one of our challenges has been aggregating the demand signal, first for the medical community and then for getting back to work, then looking at reconstituting our strategic national stockpile, and then looking for ongoing activities. So we have had the supply chain task force under Admiral Plavchek's guidance at the NRCC, looking at aggregating that demand signal. While that is going on, and we're taking part of that, what we have done is taken DPA Title III money, and then we, in order to do even more industrial expansion, we worked with lawyers to be able to use the Economy Act to move money from HHS for industrial expansion to be executed by
I'm
DoD.
sorry. That's not actually what I asked. I mean,
Okay,
that
what
that
is
sort of
the
informs
demand
it.
signal?
So I understand how many, that's a separate question, but how many are we? And if you don't know, that's fine.
Yeah, I was about to say, I do not have that. I can take that for the record, but I might call on our JADF director, Ms. Stacy Cummings, to begin to address that.
But as you're looking at the demand signal, I hear that. When I told our governor that a couple months ago, he about pulled his hair out. I'll give you a demand signal. It's very large. And so what have we learned at this point? I'll ask the question in a different way. What is the demand signal for N95 masks?
Based on our projections prior to the COVID response, we were nationally using about 50 million N95 respirators in a year. I will tell you that that demand went up to about 140 million over the 90 days of peak demand. And so what we're looking at from a demand signal is a significant increase in the use of N95 masks, which is why we made the significant investment that Ms. Lord mentioned earlier. I can tell you that based on the investments that we've made, by October of 2020, we will be seeing an increase of 450 million masks a year, and by January of 2021, an increase in total, including that 450, up to over 800 million masks.
And that's domestic production.
And that's domestic production, correct.
And I'm sorry, so you're producing 450 million a year, and your estimate is at this point, what is our need? The demand signal, if you will.
So based on having 90 days of stock, we're looking at that number being about 300 million to be used in 90 days of peak use.
So 300 million, so like 100 million a month, roughly.
About 100 million a month during peak use is on the high end of demand that we want to be able to have access to, again, during that peak.
Right, and now we're getting somewhere. So 100 million a month, and we are set to produce by the end of October 450 million a year.
450 additional million a year. By January, our annual
I'm sorry,
production,
additional to what?
additional to our base.
Okay, and our base was?
I can't tell you the proprietary information of the base that was being produced, but on individual companies.
Sorry?
But what I can tell you is that starting in 2021, we anticipate our total domestic production to be in excess of $1 billion per year. So we're getting very close to being able to meet that demand domestically, but we are not quite there yet.
Okay, and I do understand, and I don't have any problem with supplementing it internationally, but we want to try to get that number up as high as possible.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I want to yield at this point to Mr. Thornberry for any questions he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Undersecretary Lord, I just wanted to clarify part of what you talked about in your testimony. Section 3610 of the CARES Act says that contractors can be reimbursed for sick leave, paid leave, other things they've done to try to keep their folks employed. But you're telling us today that there's not the money to do that. So if that's going to happen, and it would run into the billions, so if that's going to happen, there would have to be some sort of supplemental funding.
Correct.
And otherwise, these contractors are going to have to eat several billions of dollars, which could well come at their employees' expense, which is what this was supposed to help to begin with.
Well, there's a choice there, whether or not we want to eat into readiness and modernization, or whether or not, and slow down readiness and modernization on an ongoing basis, or whether we want to remedy the situation in the next 6 months or so, and then be able to continue on to make sure that we have the ready forces that we need to have for national security.
Okay. I want to ask a broader question about the defense industrial base, and that is, do you feel like you have good visibility in what the defense industrial base is? And just as one example of that, so if we wanted a list of parts where we were down to a single supplier, can you do that? Give us some sense for how much you know about this very complex community, I guess, that supplies our men and women in uniform.
We have been gaining on our knowledge, which I would say is still insufficient, but it started out with the report we did as a result of the Executive Order 13806, the report we put out about 2 years ago. We segmented the defense industrial base. We all began to have a common lexicon, and we identified fragilities in that base, whether it be sole source suppliers or whether it be the dependence on overseas sources of supplies. That highlighted work we started doing using the Defense Production Act and other mechanisms to begin to bolster our capability. Fast forward to COVID. COVID exacerbated that fragility that we had identified through the report, and we found that we could not onshore the materials that were produced offshore, and that we might not be able to for quite some time. So what this required us to do was really accelerate our illumination of our supply base, and we've had a number of our individuals out of our acquisition group, our industrial policy group, work with specific tools to illuminate the supply chain, not only to understand who was in there and then identify what the weaknesses were, but where we had actually what I will call adversaries as one of our key suppliers. So part of our effort here is not only to identify where we are sole sourced, but where we actually need to reshore a lot of that capability. And in fact, we mentioned the $100 million of DPA Title III being used with the Development Finance Corporation. The idea is that we are taking an existing infrastructure in the government, working closely with DoD to use all the knowledge that we have gained in terms of medical resource fragility, as well as defense industrial base fragility, and we are going to use a modest amount of our DPA Title III money as collateral to go and do Treasury loans to reshore businesses so that we have the domestic capability.
Okay, and so just briefly, I take by your answer, we're working on that, single source, foreign sourced, et cetera, but we don't quite know the full extent of it yet.
We know a large amount of it. We do not know the full extent, and that is a key focus of ours, and we need to continue.
Well, it's important. I know a number of members are interested in that as well, so we look forward to working with you. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And now we reach the exciting moment of the hearing when we call on our first witness who is participating remotely, and that would be Susan Davis, who is recognized for 5 minutes. So it'll probably take a second.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, there we go. Susan,
Thank you very
for
much.
5 minutes.
And good to have this experiment at this time. I want to thank you, Madam Undersecretary Lord, very much, because I know that you've been working 24/7 at this, and we all greatly appreciate that. You know, there was an article in the Atlantic recently, how to actually use the Defense Production Act. And, you know, in the summary, excuse me, it mentions using the statute does not mean giving up on American ingenuity in an emergency, but competently maximizing it and recognizing that the energy must come from the top. Would you say that that's generally your position?
I believe that's directionally correct. What we are trying to do is send a strong demand signal that we want domestic production. So what we are doing is saying we will take papers on what level of investment could generate what increased capacity and throughput over what specific period of time, and rack and stack those applications against our requirements that are prioritized, and then begin to address them.
And would you say that those working with you are all pretty much on the same page on that?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. I wonder if you can talk then about how the department is planning to use the DPA for vaccine production distribution. Are you making those plans now? And what are the known shortcomings in vaccine distribution that the DPA would prove most useful to address?
Yes, so about 3 weeks ago or so, we bifurcated our supply chain task force efforts into Project Warp Speed and then the Strategic National Stockpile. Operation Warp Speed has two leaders, Dr. Sloawe and General Perna, who report directly to Secretaries Esper and Azar. They are working first on vaccines, then on therapeutics, and then on diagnostics. So they picked up a lot of the work, obviously being done by HHS and DHA. Right now, what they are doing is prioritizing who they are funding for vaccines and then how they will be distributed. We stand ready to support them, but right now they are finalizing all of their investment plans, and they are reporting out directly on that.
From lessons learned that we've gone through now, so what is going to be a stumbling block? Is it competition for the vaccine? What is it that you think is going to get in the way?
I think, first of all, we have to make data-driven decisions. There are a lot of anecdotes. I think we all have to have the same fact set and then prioritize and move forward. Additionally, our adversaries are watching what we are doing very closely. So the security around all of these efforts is paramount. We have to also come up with a scheme, to your earlier point, as to how we prioritize distribution. We also have to deal with the risk scenario of how do you quickly get FDA approval for a vaccine in a smart way where you are balancing risk and reward.
So what now? You have put a great deal of energy and thought into this, but I'm wondering, are there some areas that you have not been able to bring about some of the changes that you'd like to see, perhaps with the interagency? What are you not doing that you're hoping down the line?
I think initially it was a bit frustrating to go through the legal issues around moving money between agencies. We have kind of cracked the code on the Economy Act and how to have the correct documentation move quickly. That's what I would term a non-recurring engineering event that I hope we do not have to go through again, and we need to memorialize that to make sure we can activate it quickly. I think at this point we are pretty well aligned with communications up through all of the different organizations, but I think we have to remain very disciplined about communications so that we are all putting our efforts towards key objectives and not getting distracted by things that look interested. We have to be very, very disciplined.
Can I ask you then, did you have any involvement with Project Airbridge?
I'm sorry, the gentle lady's time has
coordinate or deconflict?
This is the awkward part here, but
Okay.
5 minutes are up, so I do want to move on to other members. And we have Mr. Turner up next, who is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your executing this very unique structure for us to try this. You can't think of anyone more capable than Secretary Lord. Hopefully you're hearing me in order to try this. Mr. Chairman, you spoke of the how busy Secretary Lord was with the Defense Production Act and, of course, on the defense industrial base issues. Secretary Lord, I'd like to ask you for a moment if you could give us some additional fidelity on your work on the defense industrial base. I was very impressed on the phone conference that we had with you and in the written communications that you have given us in responding to the needs of the defense industrial base. You mentioned some of those issues. In your testimony, you talked about increased costs as associated with teleworking, leave, sanitizing workspaces, and of course, work disruption. We also know that some of our defense industrial base lost some of their liquidity due to commercial interruptions and some of their supply chain interruptions. So you did this very, very quickly. So if you could give us some additional fidelities, how did you come about with this bushel basket of things that you needed to do, knowing that we had defense contractors, defense workers, suppliers, subcontractors? But then the next step that I'm really interested in is once you go through this, once you've provided this additional assistance, this additional help to try to get the defense industrial base over this this period, what type of assessment, information back are you going to be receiving as to how has this left them? What condition are they in? What has been more effective or less effective, and what new things should we be doing? And that's my only question. So after your answer, Mr. Chairman, I'll be yielding back.
Very good. So I had started, when I first took this position, meeting with industry on a quarterly basis, along with 15 or so of my colleagues at the Department of Defense. I leveraged 3 industry associations that I thought really caught everything from small business to large primes so that we got a good cross-section. We used those quarterly meetings with CEOs to both push information that we thought that was useful, but probably more importantly to listen to industry about what their concerns and issues were. When the pandemic hit and we saw how catastrophic it could be to our defense industrial base, what we did was just really amp up those engagements. So starting on March 17th, we had our first telecon with industry, and we broadened beyond just the 3 industry associations that we worked with to really start including non-traditionals and others. And for multiple weeks, we had calls 3 times a week. One of those calls per week was focused on small business, and we listened to what the problems were. And as a result of that, the team sitting behind me, a lot of the leadership of A&S, listened to what the issues were, and we tried to start taking the first small steps. We realized liquidity was really the most key issue. So what we did is we started trying to simplify how to do business. We raised micro threshold levels. We changed progress payments. In fact, there's a whole binder I have right here that has over 30 different memos from defense pricing and contracting to ease how to do business. What we did is we got real-time feedback 3 times a week on what the biggest pain points were so that we could prioritize all of those memos to provide some relief. On the other side, what we did is we started more regular convening of what we call our industrial base council. I look at OSD as kind of the corporate function with my customers being the operating units, which are the services. We had the service acquisition executives, logisticians, others together, and we have worked every week for the last 2 months to rack and stack what the SAEs were seeing for critical issues so that we could focus our Defense Production Act Title III investments, as well as start putting programs on contracts faster. Each of the services has dozens more contracts that have been awarded this time of the year than they did last year. So again, it was listening to industry, constantly getting feedback.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I have to move on to the next questioner, and that is Mr. Langevin, who is recognized for 5 minutes.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Undersecretary Lord. I want to thank you for attending today's hearing and for accommodating to the new format of these hearings. I've got a couple of COVID-related questions, but before I get to that, I just wanted to call your attention to Section 1648 of last year's NDAA, which called for a comprehensive framework to strengthen the cybersecurity of the defense industrial base. And we made an important first step with the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program. But I have to tell you, what we received from the department was really wholly unacceptable. The first update that the department provided to Congress really appeared to show that the department has not really made a good faith effort to deconflict, synchronize, and harmonize the various programs that we depend on to keep the industrial base safe. So what I wanted to ask you, I hope that you'll commit to providing the committee with all the specific factors described in the legislation.
Absolutely. In fact, we've taken one of our key leaders, Katie Arrington. She is very, very focused on this area. We work closely with NSA as well as the services because we understand the vulnerabilities and we need to commit the funds to make sure that we have a secure and resilient set of warfighting tools.
Okay, thank you. That's something my subcommittee is going to be following closely. Look forward to work with you. I appreciate the work that Ms. Arrington is doing, and look forward to getting a more comprehensive update from the department in the very near future in that case. Let me turn to a COVID-related question. Last week, we heard from the Defense Logistics Agency that they're working to give defense companies on the defense industrial base potentially testing equipment to allow them to do testing themselves. Electric Boat, just by way of example, in my district, has been calling for the capability for quite some time. They've taken some steps on their own, but given their medical facilities that they have on site, it makes it possible for them to do that. But can you please update us on what the DoD is doing to determine, disseminate testing equipment to defense critical infrastructure?
What we are doing is reaching out beyond just our government contracting employees, and we are now reaching out to small businesses and making our Fed Mall available. So what this is going online, searching just like you would at home for a variety of things, so that you can go and compare and contrast different PPE and other materials. We are trying to make that much more accessible to small businesses, and we're working to see how that can be legally accessed by states as well.
So using the purchasing power and the logistic capability of the DoD to help both acquire and then also disseminate the equipment. Did I understand that?
Correct.
Correctly?
And so one of the challenges, which was highlighted in an earlier question, is aggregating a demand signal. If we can have a more focused location to aggregate that demand signal, that gives us better leverage, better price capability, and so forth, and frankly eases the ability to come in and get PPE, and we plan to grow that capability into other things as well.
Okay. So I know that wave one of the coronavirus appears to be receding, but listening to medical health officials and what's happening around the country, really scientists have found really sounded the alarm for future waves. You've touched on some of this already, but Ms. Lord, what groundwork are you laying to ensure now that the DoD can quickly amass and distribute resources just in case another wave does occur in the fall? And are you prepared for that?
Yeah, what we are doing is not only modernizing the strategic nuclear stockpile for the nation, meaning that we will have IT systems that will easily let us know what we have and where it is, but we are doing the same thing with our DoD stockpile. That means looking at what is in it, what the levels should be, and making sure we reconstitute it very quickly so that we not only have the capability to deliver day by day, but that we have a ready reserve.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Rogers is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Lord, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for your service to our country. Early in this pandemic, we were having some troubles. Our contractors, our defense contractors, were having some troubles obtaining parts from Mexico because of the different way that they were handling the pandemic from us. And I understand you were working on that. Can you tell us the status of that situation now?
Absolutely. My latest DCMA reports say that everything is open in Mexico. What we did to support that effort was what we did with governors here domestically, when local and state regulations are put out, sometimes there is a disparity in terms of how they are interpreted. So what I did in terms of Mexico was to call our embassy, talk to all of the U.S. officials there, give them a prioritized list of companies that were critical links in our supply chain, and called back every day giving data until they were able to open them up. So the Mexican government was very, very responsive once they had the facts and figures. So the second area we've had issues there is India, which we're working through most of those, and then a variety of other small ones.
Great, thank you. I want to follow up on the line of questioning from Mr. Thornberry, where he talked to you about the consequences of the COVID impact on your budget, and then the impact that that's had on our defense contractors and their employees. There seems to be a genuine consensus that there's going to be a fourth iteration of relief/recovery funding following the CARES Act sometime in July. Do you anticipate offering a number to the administration of funding that you need to backfill to replace the funds that you had to use to deal with COVID?
All right, you broke up a little bit there, but I think the question was, do we have a number to make up for what I'll call the COVID penalty to contractors on their existing contracts and so forth?
Correct.
Yes, we have rough numbers on that. We have submitted them. They are at OMB right now.
Great. Thank you, ma'am. I yield back.
All right. Chair Smith is out for a bit, and so I will take over the chair as it happens. I'm also next in line. So first off, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes and ask unanimous consent to include in the record the letter from Governor Jay Inslee to Vice President Mike Pence, which Chair Smith mentioned earlier regarding Washington State's experience with PPE and the need for the DPA implementation. Second, I want to follow up on what Mr. Rogers was discussing as well. You mentioned that there is a number that you've estimate, I guess. Can you share that estimate with the committee today about what those, I guess, the COVID penalty costs are?
It would be in the double digit of billions of dollars.
So somewhere between $10 billion and $99 billion?
On the lower end of that, yes.
Thank you. All right, thanks. Second, do you have, other than that though, do you have guidance for allowable costs, specific guidance for allowable costs under Section 3610? My recollection from your testimony is that it will arrive shortly.
We have put out an enormous amount of guidance on this. It's a dialogue with industry, again, to make sure we understand what the needs are. We are committing to within 30 days, I think less than that, to put out final guidance. But just for your reference, we're working through, looking at confirmed cases or quarantines, government facility closures or stand downs, test delays. This is really a key item if you couldn't get out to a range and so forth, because of research and development center inefficiencies, telework, closures due to travel restrictions, logistic implications caused by travel restrictions requiring commercial flight, availability of parts and supplies, high absentee rates, local and state lockdowns, foreign government lockdowns, company and supplier
Thank you.
shutdowns.
So I understand it's fairly broad and fairly specific, and you mentioned 30 days. Is that 30 days from today or 30 days from a day before this?
30 days from today.
Okay.
We will have it done.
Okay, thanks. Next question I have for you is still on the supply chain, but I think I mentioned this when we had the briefing call a few months back, or whenever that was, a few weeks back. And that had to do with the use of the DPA beyond COVID-19 and the flexibility that the department has. There was a particular instance with aluminum in use in defense manufacturing, which has an impact in Washington State. There's a aluminum plant there that is curtailed 100% for other reasons, but still the need for aluminum. Can you speak at all to how you are thinking about using the DPA for either commodity purchase or purchases otherwise? And are you contemplating that?
We are contemplating anything that is a constraint at this point. The way we've broken down looking at the DIB has typically been aircraft, shipbuilding, space, soldier systems. At this point, I am unaware of a cross-cutting commodity, but I think I'm going to ask Kevin Fahey to come up and address this. Kevin, as you know, is ASD for acquisition, and he's the one that's closest to the actual programs and goes to all of the industrial base meetings.
Yes,
sir.
I would note I have a 1 minute and 15 seconds. Go
Yes,
ahead.
sir, just really quick. So what we do is all the program officers bring in their issues where they see the supply chain. We also have industry that comes in and talks to us. That specific issue has not been brought to us from the Aluminum Washington. If it came in, we prioritize it. Basically, the first priority is things that were specifically impacted by COVID. And most of that, as you can imagine, is driven by the financial situation of supply chain, those kind of things.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks.
But there is the opportunity. If there is a need, we want to hear that. So I would say that Kevin is the person to reach out to for those who have issues.
So I'll just conclude by saying what I heard you say is, one, you have the flexibility to address that. Second, you have financial authority to address that.
Correct.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Just one quick note on the remotely participating members. If you are in fact sitting there, it's good to leave the video on. Now, just like in a regular hearing, members come and go, and if you happen to be eating lunch or something, we don't have to view that, so you can turn it off. But if you are sitting there like you would normally be there, it's good to leave the video on, just so we can know who's there. But you got to move around. Move around is fine. Next up is Mr. Conaway, recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Story, thank you for being here. What I heard in the conversation about PPE particularly was that you're trying to put something on your pandemic peak supply capacity from domestic production, which would be great if the peak lasts a long time. Most of us think it'll ebb at some point in time, but you look like you put in place a significant amount of capacity that might not be needed when the pandemic ebbs. Can you talk to us a bit about what's in the contracts that will allow companies to unwind that capacity, or is it in the contract that they have to maintain it while they do some other things? And what's the cost going to be to the taxpayer to maintain that what at some point in time will be excess capacity for PPE? Will we know what those costs are on a running rate?
So two separate issues in my mind. The DPA Title III provides funds through contracts to companies for facilities, equipment, tooling, training, flowing down funds through the work, through the supply chain. The idea is either to preserve capacity or to increase it. Separate and distinct issue of letting contracts for a certain number of items over a certain amount of time. What we are doing is carefully looking at what we think demand signals are, and there is, again, a diversity of thought about that, and we will not over-invest in an area where we do not need more capacity or believe we will have excess capacity. So those are the trades that are being done, because obviously we don't have an infinite amount of money, and we have to prioritize what we're doing.
Well, let's use your N95 masks as an example. You said by January, we will have the capacity to do 80 million a month. Peak demand was, what I heard, was 100 million a month. We're not at peak demand now, but so is that 80 million a month paid for, or is that capacity that would be, I mean, you don't need to keep making these masks and stacking them up in a warehouse anywhere beyond a certain point. What will happen to those, to that 80 million a month under this scenario?
So again, the capacity is there. We let contracts that are separate and distinct.
Okay, yeah, but the capacity, yes, ma'am, the capacity has a cost. Will you maintain the capacity, and how much will that maintaining of the capacity cost is really the issue?
Yeah, correct. In terms of maintaining capacity, that would typically be captured in overhead rates and so forth. And if we get to the point where we built up the strategic national stockpile and the monthly utilization no longer requires the entire capacity that we have in the nation, then typically what businesses would do would be to repurpose or idle certain lines so they're not paying to keep something operational if there's not a demand signal. But again, we're trying to be smart about that so that we are not going to find ourselves in a huge overcapacity situation.
Okay, I understand how a private company would react on its own nickel. I just want to make sure that you've got the authorities to react in that exact same manner when it's clear that capacity is not longer, and the taxpayers no longer have to pay folks for idle capacity. Did I hear you say that?
Absolutely correct. And again, when we write contracts, if they're long-term contracts, they typically have a base and then option years that can be executed. So we typically are incredibly reticent about committing to long-term contracts where the demand signal is unclear.
Okay, well, I think you understand my concern, and appreciate your testimony today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yell back.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney is recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Secretary Lord, for being here. I also want to thank you for the quick follow-up after the April 16th teleconference call regarding CARES Act Section 3610. Again, you followed up in terms of some of your comments about the sort of scope of the paid leave in terms of the department's interpretation of the CARES Act. And as you point out, the sort of Q&A FAQ sort of guidance that the department's been putting out has also been helpful in terms of putting some precision around the scope of the reimbursable paid leave. But as you point out, an unfunded authorization kind of leaves us frustrated in terms of being able to convert that into a reality for a lot of these workers who, some of whom have contracted coronavirus, and obviously the intent of Congress needs to be followed up on with an appropriation. So you indicated to Mr. Larson that the department, I guess, is putting its arms around a figure. Are you doing that based on claims that are being submitted by contractors, regarding specific workers who've been out for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, hospital? Is there something that we're going to really see that's very clear cut so that we can help with the appropriators if again, there is going to be another COVID bill at the end of July?
The figure that we arrived at is data-driven. We have not yet had any contractors actually submit claims because they're aware that there is not an appropriation yet, and I believe that they're concerned they might get a one-time shot and want to make sure what the entire situation is. That being said, our DPC group, as well as acquisition, have spent an enormous amount of time talking with contractors and understanding the range of challenges that they see. Our Defense Contract Management Agency has individuals embedded in all of the major primes and visiting the smaller ones. So we have eyes on every day. And in fact, I get data every morning that we share at our startup in terms of the 20,000 roughly companies that we track, the number of closures, the days average that they're closed, the number of openings, what level of workforce they have. So we can do some rough calculations ourselves, but our boots on the ground, so to speak, are collecting their own information and talking with management teams. So we believe that we understand the lower end of the number. I believe there will be some delayed issues because, again, our primes are trying to look down through their supply chains. But as you get lower in the supply chain, typically some of the tier 2s or 3s are not sharing with the tier 1s all of their issues because they don't want to reveal a lot of what they think is proprietary data and so forth. So I think it will be a while to unravel. We just actually had another teleconference, actually a video teleconference that we set up this morning for Secretary Esper with a lot of the large primes where we talked about this very issue.
So again, the fact that Congress already took at least half a step with an authorization shows that I think there's support for making sure that we finish the job and really compensate people particularly for their sick leave. So to the extent that you can incorporate us in terms of that data-driven analysis so that we can help, I would encourage the department to do that.
Thank you. Once the figures are released, I will commit to coming back and doing that because that's in our mutual best interest. Because again, I'm very concerned. The defense industrial base, I believe, is the nexus of economic security and national security, and it's vitally important to make sure they remain as healthy as possible.
Great. Thank you. I yield back, Adam.
Thanks, Joe. Up next is Mr. Whitman, recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Lord, thanks for joining us. I want to talk about the ship repair, maintenance, and overhaul industry. As you know, there have been some challenges there prior to COVID-19. The requirement up to COVID-19 on payments to the industry was 90% payment or 10% retainage, or what they call progress payments, up to 90%, and then 95% for small businesses. And as we have seen those yards now have to accommodate more ships, so more maintenance availabilities, longer duration, there's more and more of those dollars that are being held up. In fact, it's right now over $100 million is in retainage for those yards. Those dollars are needed for those yards to reinvest, to get the capacity necessary to keep the throughput going, to repair the ships, not only that are there now, but the ships that are to come to those yards. And we all know the longer the ship's in the yard, the less available it is, and availability has become a big issue these days as we make sure that we're meeting readiness needs. To give Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gertz credit, he said, okay, we're going to change that because of COVID-19. We're going to drop that down to 1% retainage, so they get 99% of those dollars, which has been a tremendous help. The question is that's a temporary measure. Would the Pentagon consider making that a permanent measure to help the cash flow for our ship maintenance, repair, and overhaul industry?
I know that Secretary Gertz is spending an enormous amount of time on this and talking with CEOs and a number of individuals on a weekly basis. I think at this point, we are letting the data drive us, and we are not drawing any hard lines. We want to be flexible. I think there are a lot of things that we have learned during this pandemic that we don't want to unlearn, but we have to look at the value equation, obviously for the taxpayer, and what we're getting for deliveries as well. But again, we will remain open and flexible to what makes the best sense for all of us.
So if the data indicates things are going well, the contractors are performing with this 1% retainage going forward, would the Pentagon make it permanent?
I don't want to speak for the Navy right now,
Okay.
but I will tell you, I think it would get serious consideration.
Okay, very good. Let me ask you too, our committee is very focused obviously on resources. As you talked about earlier, maintaining readiness is incredibly important. We know the challenges that we face now with COVID-19 related costs. We want to make sure we're getting money to restoring readiness, to modernization. But last week, a major industry partner, that is Ken Posenreedy from Lockheed, who's the CFO, raised the idea of the benefit of a global settlement, that is a macro adjustment on equitable adjustment on costs related to COVID-19. So instead of going contract by contract to look at it and say, how do we come up with a way to make sure that everybody is justly compensated for the cost associated with COVID-19? Would make it much faster, make it much less complicated, and make it much less likely that there's going to be protests to say, well, you did this for this contractor, but you didn't do it for this contractor. What processes or mechanisms are you considering to efficiently manage the coming wave of what we know are going to be COVID-19 adjustments to make sure that they're fair and equitable, and to make sure there's an opportunity to make things right? And is there an opportunity for a global settlement of some kind?
I'm going to ask Mr. Kim Harrington, who runs Defense Pricing and Contracting, to address that because he's spending an enormous amount of his time on 3610 and equitable adjustment.
Yes, sir. When Ms. Lord referenced that final guidance would be coming out within a month's time period, that is in fact what we're working on right now. As she noted about our industry engagement discussions, that has been one of the primary topics. We gave industry an opportunity to provide input to us. We got about 100 pages of input, and so that is in fact what we are working on right now, is to come up with the most efficient way to resolve those reimbursements. And you're right that global settlements would make a lot of sense in many cases, not all, but many.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Can you hear me?
We got you. It's all working quite well, actually.
Mrs. Lord, it's great to see you again. Look forward to when we can get together. A number of issues jump up to us right away, but I want to stay on the REAs, the request for equitable adjustments. Is that the only method that's available to contractors to look to the government to absorb their COVID cost?
No, I think 3610 is separate and distinct from equitable adjustments. And again, I'll ask Kim Harrington to differentiate between the two and perhaps comment on anything else.
Yeah, so what I would say, sir, is there's sort of three buckets that we think about in terms of these costs, where these would fall. The request for equitable adjustment is codified in regulation around specific actions that the government takes to drive. So in cases where maybe we issued a stop work, or maybe where a facility was closed, a government facility was closed, that would be a case for a traditional REA. As Ms. Lord noted, 3610 was authorized by Congress, and so that's sort of a separate bucket. And then you've got everything else from PPE costs to facility rearrangement to social distance and things of that nature.
I understand. That's the point we're trying to make. I'm pressed for time.
Right.
Is that there are more than one area. The REA is something that has been set up and they can do it. We spoke with Dr. Jetty during a briefing yesterday, and he indicated few, if any, REAs have come through. So there is more than one bite at the apple, and we want to make sure, because not all companies are created equal in terms of how this affected them. But the number we were told were $4 to $6 billion. So hearing a double-digit figure, Mrs. Lord, is something that is a bit of a surprise to us. Let me ask you, in looking at the budget and what has been spent this year, are we spending everything that has been given to us, or are there some savings across the entire DoD that we might tap into before we start looking for us to give additional monies?
Well, I think you're aware that the CMO, at the request of Secretary Esper, has been working on defense-wide reviews, and we have swept up, if you will, a lot of funds that we are refocusing on modernization. So it is all a matter of priorities. Right now, we don't see the flexibility except out of programs themselves. If, again, we wanted to affect what could be delivered out of programs to address this cost.
Well, we saw in the past where reprogramming has taken place to fund the wall. So we didn't like it then, so I don't think we like it anymore now. I just want to follow up on a quote that you made earlier. We wanted domestic production, and certainly we do too. During yesterday's briefing, we got a list of the nations that we're working with. Would you be supportive of bringing up the domestic content to close to 100%? And if you wouldn't, why wouldn't you? And this is outside of F-35 program.
I understand both for medical resources as well as the defense industrial base, we would like to have as much defense or domestic production as possible. Obviously, competition is always our friend, so we like to have two sources of supply wherever, but we are actively looking at reshoring a number of critical items for all of the reasons that we've cited during this hearing and all of the challenges we have faced getting critical equipment to the assembly lines.
So obviously, people are now understanding at a different level why being made in America is important. But again, would you be supportive of bringing that rate up closer to high percent incrementally? We can't do this overnight, but what we hear time after time is we want predictability. You can't change it 1 year. Would you be in favor of predictable ways bringing up that percentage?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I have Mr. Desjardins next. Recognized for 5 minutes. Is he still with us? Does not sound like it. So next we probably have is Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Lord, for being here. It's very important. I think one of the things that I want to concentrate on, it kind of goes to what Chairman Mr. Conaway from Texas said, is initially, number one, we had some stockpiles, and then we started production. But within just the production, then you also have the distribution and who's prioritizing where those distribution goes. And that priority is both by location and by need, i.e., do nurses need it, do grocery store need it, does New York City need it, or does Mississippi need it? Who is responsible for coordinating, number one, the production, which is you, but then the distribution and the prioritization of where that distribution goes for PPE, for example, whether it's mask or hand sanitizer or those things?
That has come out of the supply chain task force working at the NRCC between FEMA and HHS with strong support from DoD, with Admiral Plavchek leading that, and then reporting up through the UCG up to the White House task force.
And I'm a little different than everyone else. We kind of got caught unexpectedly with all these things that we didn't know that we would need. But I thought we did a phenomenal job, DoD specifically, in helping with that distribution. I can tell you in my home state of Mississippi, we had our MEMA, our Mississippi Emergency Management, which didn't have the number of personnel nor the logistics experience, which the Mississippi National Guard just sent a few planners over there, which helped them with distribution and supply points and also in those priorities. What are we doing, Secretary Lord, to make sure that we capture our lessons learned? Who's conducting an interagency and an interdepartment AAR and lessons learned so that when we face the next pandemic or the next big event in the United States, that we capture these lessons, Lord, and take them forward?
The individual agencies are, and I know the White House task force is looking at that. I will tell you in terms of distribution of PPE and medical resources, one of the highest priority items right now is to have a modern IT system that we would typically have in some other industries so that the government can track where all of this is and also ensure that they only use carriers that they can track so they know where everything is all of the time. That was a huge lesson learned early on in the pandemic, as was the entire acquisition process, because we were asking a group at HHS that typically only does about $5 billion of acquisitions a year to look at this huge tidal wave, and that's why DoD has come in to really set up processes and help out in an emergency situation. But we want to make sure we get irreversible momentum so that we leave behind a sustainable acquisition and distribution system that can be utilized in the future.
And then the final thing that I think we need to capture out of this, but initially hand sanitizer was a big deal. I had a meadery that turned into immediately processing hand sanitizer, which now is no longer needed. So, you know, they've got to look at getting back. The same thing with like stockpiles of N95 masks or ventilators or all these other things. Some of those things go out with dates. So you have a strategic stockpile, but it has to be rotated. And so, but at some point, the rotational value of maintaining that stockpile will be less than the production required to keep that stockpile rotated. Who is responsible for managing that going forward and in the future? Is that the Defense Production Act? Is that you, Secretary Lord, or who is that?
Well, for the Strategic National Stockpile, HHS has responsibility for that. I will tell you at DoD, we have our War Stopper stockpile, and we do that, I think, in a relatively innovative way where we are paying manufacturers to keep stock in hand, but it's rotated so it's not aging. We always have to have a certain amount available, but I think it's kind of a win-win situation. We are trying to share all of those techniques with HHS to, again, just not only reconstitute the strategic national stockpile, but to modernize it.
Very good, and I knew that was the answer, and thank y'all for what you've done in assisting other organizations with that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Representative Slotkin.
To whom? Okay. Ms. Slotkin? A generous offer by Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Slotkin, are you available? I think you may have to unmute yourself. We cannot hear you at the moment. Yeah, I don't know. We can't hear you. I don't know why we can't hear you. I see you're talking. I see your hands moving. But if you can hear me, it had to happen at some point. But we do not. Yeah, we do not have Ms. Slotkin. So for now, Mr. Gallego, if you wish to use the time.
Mr. Chairman, who's next on the roster after me?
Ms. Trahan is the next Democrat. Sorry, Mr. Brindisi. Mr. Brindisi is next after you. But
I yield my time to that person.
okay, that doesn't work great because he's going to have his own time here in just a couple of minutes. Why don't we try to figure out the technical problem with Ms. Slotkin? I will reserve Mr. Gallego's 5 minutes, and once we figure out the technical problem with Ms. Slotkin, I will go back to Mr. Gallego, who can then give his time to Ms. Slotkin, and we'll call her up. But for now, we'll give Mr. Brindisi a shot. Mr. Brindisi, are you on the line? And you know what's funny about this? When I said things were going so well, Rick Larson looked at me and said, you know, you just screwed the whole thing up, and he was right. Okay, so we don't have Mr. Brindisi, and Ms. Slotkin is still, for some reason, not able to communicate.
Oh, somebody just came on.
Wait a second. I hear a voice. No. All right, I'll give Ms. Trahan a shot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right.
And
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Lord, thank you so much for coming before the committee. I think the entire committee is grateful that DLA stepped in and played such a major logistical role at a time when there was no blueprint, and I'm sure a fair amount of silo busting that you had to make happen. You know, as I walk through the timeline between national emergency being declared on March 13th, and then the White House issuing an executive order to compel GM to accept, perform, and prioritize federal contracts for ventilators. I'm just trying to diagnose the primary source of, delay or friction. Was it lack of authorities? Was it interagency logistics? Was it the realization that our supply chain was largely overseas? But I'm wondering if you could just speak to that.
Are you asking in general or specifically about GM?
No, just in general.
In general, I think again that this was a gargantuan task that first had to be analyzed. What were the issues? What was needed? And we had individuals at FEMA who are very good at reacting to specific events like a hurricane or a forest fire. We had people at HHS who were brilliant medical individuals and research individuals and so forth. But there wasn't the combination of expertise in terms of operational and programmatic knowledge to go and procure complex systems that perhaps had different training needs, had different parts that had to be purchased, consumables to keep them going. Yeah. There was not the experience with complex distribution systems with evolving demand signals that had to be reprioritized. So I think it was an issue of both scale and scope very quickly.
Yeah.
And I believe that the Department of Defense, by the nature of what we do, is better equipped to deal with those very abrupt, very large, very complex dilemmas. And it took a bit to really sort through the authorities and how to make sure we were legally helping out on both the acquisition and distribution side. So there was a bit of learning, non-recurring engineering, I would say, that had to happen, that we have captured that now, and I believe we have the mechanisms, so we've learned from that, and we should not see that in the future, and we plan on leaving a very sustainable system that can be handled so that we don't see this again.
I appreciate all of that. And in a perfect world, I mean, if we were going to build a system to respond with agility and speed to, a pandemic, one that might, be right around the corner, should this continue to be an interagency response? I mean, organizationally, we don't exactly get the economies of scale through a shared services model. And you have a pretty demanding day job. Should that rest with, HHS? Should they have a medical industrial base? I've heard you say bringing that supply chain home is an important a priority. There's no question there's a huge momentum that those manufacturing jobs home. But would it take some of the friction out of the system if that rested with HHS and they had its own, MLA and authorities that they sort of had singularly?
I think that remains to be seen. We are just now getting to somewhat of a steady state with these systems. There's a lot of support planned through September for HHS. FEMA is stepping back a little bit now that we're getting into hurricane and forest fire season. And we have a team that will remain with HHS through September. We will see at that point whether or not that's sustainable. And I think that we at DoD can always provide a surge capacity, an assistance system capacity. I don't believe that generally it's a good idea to duplicate capabilities at scale around the government.
I'm sorry, the gentlelady's time has expired. If you had a closing thought there. Did you want to wrap up?
Certainly, yes. I was just going to say, I don't think they need something right now. Hopefully, we can leave them with the system and we can augment as needed.
Thank you very much. So just an update here. So next up, we're going to go Ms. Hartzler, followed by Brindisi and Bacon. We are still trying to resolve the issue with Ms. Slotkin to try to make sure we can get her mic to work. And when we do, we'll come back to Mr. Gallego for the yielding of that time. But for now, Ms. Hartzler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Lord, for the great job that you've done in a very difficult time in our nation to stand up and keep our industrial base strong and to make sure Americans have the supplies that they need. I have a few different questions. The first one is about Section 889 of the FY19 National Defense Authorization Act, which prohibits federal agencies from companies that use any equipment, a system, or service from certain Chinese telecommunication companies like ZTE and Huawei. And very strong supporter of this provision and offered an amendment to expand the prohibition to Chinese video surveillance equipment from Hikvision, Hytera, and Daha. And I don't believe that these video surveillance equipment should be on any of our critical federal property as well. But I understand that the contractors who are supposed to remove this equipment are having some difficulty due to COVID, and the administration has not released the rules yet for what they need to do specifically, and the deadline is August 13th. So do you feel like the deadline needs to be extended for them to be able to comply, or do you have an update for us on when these rules will be released and when we can expect that this equipment will be removed?
Absolutely. Section 889, I believe, is of critical importance. As you know, Section A has been released and complied with. Part B of that, we are 100% behind the intent of that. We at DoD are a bit concerned about the 2-year deadline, not for our own facilities quite as much as that of the industrial base. While what we find is, if you look all the way down the supply chain, it is a heavy lift to find all of this equipment everywhere. And the thought that somebody in 6 or 7 levels down in the supply chain could have one camera in a parking lot, and that would invalidate one of our major primes being able to do business with us, gives us a bit of pause. So we are very supportive of it, but I believe we need to extend it in terms of the time for compliance, so that we don't have unintended consequences.
Okay, thank you. I'll be working with you guys on that to see what we can do, and appreciate your support of it. We want it to be workable, but we certainly appreciate your support in getting that implemented. I want to switch gears. As you know, there's been a lot of discussion about our dependence on China for our critical pharmaceuticals and our medicines for our military. And as we discussed in April 21st hearing, my colleague, John Garamendi, who's on this call, as well as myself, introduced a bill, the Pharmaceutical Independence Long-Term Readiness Reform Act, which seeks to take the first step in tackling this issue by ensuring that America produces the medicines, the vaccines, and the vitamins and the antibiotics for our military. Can you share with us what the Department of Defense is doing currently with the Defense Production Act to help stand up pharmaceuticals? Are you already taking steps to go down this road and help, or what else do we need to do to get that back here at our shores?
We very much are focused on that. I'm going to ask Stacey Cummings to come up and speak to some of the specifics. One point is, early on, we worked with lawyers so that we could tap into the $17 billion of the CARES Act that went to HHS for some of this industry expansion. So APIs, advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, are an area that we are spending a lot of time on now, reshoring, using the industry expansion dollars through the CARES Act. And Stacey has some of those specifics.
Thank you. Yes, so what we did when we stood up the JADF is we set up some product leads across different functional areas, and pharmaceuticals and APIs was one of those areas that we saw as a direction that we needed to look into. So when we look at the Strategic National Stockpile, our first focus has been partnering with HHS on PPE. Our next area of focus is critical care medications, pharmaceuticals, and we have, through our industry portal, been capturing proposals and ideas from industry as well as from government on where we can make the next investment dollar to look at those most critical pharmaceuticals and APIs and those most valuable next investments to be able to onshore and create domestic production.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, the gentle lady's time has expired. So we're going to give Mr. Gallego another shot here. I believe we have Ms. Lotkin queued up. Mr. Gallego, of course, I said it would be hysterical at this point if you declined to yield. It is your time. Mr. Gallego, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield to Representative Swatkin.
All right.
Thank you, Representative Gallego.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Apologies for the hiccup. And thank you, Undersecretary Lord, for being here. And your whole approach to the committee during COVID has been really commendable, and I really appreciate the communication. I feel like I've rarely seen an issue where so many people agree, where that we just, after the experience of COVID, learned in real time that certain supplies, certain issues, certain medical supplies and pharmaceuticals, at least a portion of them should be produced here, should be able to surge here. And I guess my first question is, we've talked a lot of what you've done with the Defense Production Act, which is great. But if you were looking out in the future, what are the 2 or 3 things this committee can do to help enshrine in law some things that incentivize even more production onshore? What are the 2 or 3 things you'd recommend?
Well, obviously, money solves some problems, but it usually has to be accompanied by policy. So I think if there was a preference for onshore supplies, that would be useful, but we have to think about the cost of doing business with this. So providing the money to reshore, set up factories and so forth is one step, but I believe we need to recognize that a lot of business went offshore because of a lot of bureaucratic hurdles and cost. One of those are tax incentives. So this committee might think about what tax incentives could be provided in order to make it more attractive to produce here domestically. And those taxes could take a lot of different forms in different portions, whether it be real estate or workforce or training or whatever it might be, different relief.
Thank you for that. I think we have a lot of folks who feel very strongly about this issue, so we'd love to work with you, even if they're small issues that we can do through the NDAA. The other question I have is looking forward. We learned through this process there's a lot of things we don't have on the shelves that we needed. My question is, going forward, how will you manage requirements? Who's going to keep the list of stuff that we want to have in supply? Who's going to refresh that list? What does your requirements list look like, and who owns that list?
From a DoD perspective, we're saying?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so what we realized was there were critical items that we never thought about before, most of this PPE, for instance. So acquisition and sustainment has partnered very, very closely with the Joint Staff. The Joint Staff typically develops requirements, and then we work on the acquisition and distribution portion of this. There's been quite a robust discussion within DoD about this. We have a DoD task force that is chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Norquist, as well as the Vice Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hyten. And many of us meet with them 3 times a week or so, and these are the very items that we're grappling with. We have been working on a demand signal for PPE, all kinds of medical resources on an ongoing basis, first looking at medical facility requirements, which was the first demand signal, and then for the nation to get back to work, then for a strategic stockpile, and then, what is the ongoing need, especially if we have another spike here sometime this fall. So that's a work in progress, but I will tell you, enormous progress has been made. The Joint Staff is the group within Department of Defense who owns requirements.
We're looking at some possible NDAA language that we'd love to work with you on, just to maintain after this COVID experience is over, first wave and second wave, just making sure we have a more regular process to update those requirements and refresh those requirements. I don't want to go over time since I'm already on borrowed time, but thanks very much for being here, and thanks to Representative Gallego.
Lady yields back. Chairman had to step
I yield
out.
back, Mr. Chair.
The chairman had to step out, so Representative Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Secretary Lord. I appreciate you being here today. You do a great job here, just as you do all the other times you've come in, so I really appreciate you. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we did in FY19 NDA concerning the supply chain with any involvement with certain Chinese companies like ZTE and Huawei. We put some restrictions in there, and the administration is supposed to get back to us in a report. Are you concerned about the department's ability to implement subsection 889 on the current timeline, especially the COVID crisis? And what do you recommend? And the reason I ask that, with less than 2 months to implement, the administration has not yet released additional guidance. And so I'm just curious where we're at with that. Are we able to comply with the supply chain restrictions in regards to Huawei and ZTE? Thank you.
So very, very supportive of Section 889. Obviously, we've implemented Part A. Part B, I am 100% behind the intent. I am very concerned about being able to implement it in August as well as totally comply within 2 years. I think the majority of it can be done, but we have very complex supply chains, and we are just now getting better at illuminating the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th levels. And I am concerned that we might have some unintended consequences with shutting down major portions of our defense industrial base because of one infraction of a Hikvision, camera in a parking lot somewhere at a level 4 supplier. So we, again, are very, very supportive of the intent. I am concerned about unintended consequences. I believe we need more time.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think that's an outstanding answer. That's my question. I yield back, but I appreciate your insight on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cisneros.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Lord, thank you for being here, you and your staff. I led on a bipartisan letter along with my colleague, Congressman Bacon, on this committee addressed to Secretary Esper and Secretary Azar about support for small businesses that have stepped up to manufacture critical supplies in this time of need. We have small business owners in our district that are concerned about the future viability of producing such critical supplies without certainty. I appreciate what the department is doing to support the defense industrial base writ large, but what is the department doing, including in support to HSS, to support small businesses? Now, we have small businesses that have switched their production to start making PPE, and they're kind of worried about the uncertainty. They don't know how much material that they need to buy because they're not sure how long this is going to continue. So how do we give them that certainty?
Understood. In fact, we have had many, many VTCs with small business, and last week we had Secretary Esper do a VTC with many small business associations. What we are doing just now is getting ready to have a series of industry days in the next 30 days, outlining many of our requirements for the Strategic National Stockpile. We will, during those industry days, we will lay out what the demand signal looks like. That should provide certainty. We did not have this coalesced in order to have a large demand signal all at once previously, but I think that is one of the keys. Secondly, we have portals where they can go. They can always call our industrial policy team at ANS. We've gone to great lengths, and we will provide your office with this to provide what we call a placemat with all kinds of links into the department. Small business is where most of our innovation in this country comes from. Obviously, liquidity is critical to them at this point in time, and we want to be there to support them. We would like to have as much small business involvement as possible. So I think in these industry days, and again, we can provide your office with information, they will get a lot more detail about opportunities coming up in the very near term that will be very significant in terms of volume and duration.
All right, well, thank you for that. So as we move forward and we look at lessons learned, what other items are we looking at that DoD procures that primarily depend on overseas procurement? Are we creating a list and hey, we depend a lot on overseas procurement for this. Maybe we need to kind of start thinking about manufacturing some of these items in CONUS. Are we taking a look at that?
Absolutely. We started with the 13806 Defense Industrial Base report that, again, highlighted fragility, and we are working down that list. I will tell you two things that I am particularly concerned about. One is processing of rare earth minerals that affects us in so many different ways. We need to have a domestic capability for that. That's on one end. The other area that I am extremely concerned about that we are working to come up with a variety of, I think, innovative solutions is the whole microelectronics supply base. This is an area where we have a lot of foreign dependency, and I think we have the entire supply chain thinking differently over the last year, and especially over the last 3 months, and I think they're willing to be far more creative in terms of looking at public-private partnerships and a number of other things. So many items that we have prioritized, we can share the list with you, but I will say top of mind right now are rare earth mineral processing and the entire microelectronic supply chain, including foundries.
And as we move to some in-CONUS production, whether it be for swabs, PPE, face mask, face covers, as we started to do that, how do we ensure this industrial base doesn't go away? I mean, there is going to be times where it's going to be like, just like it's happened before. It's cheaper to make it overseas. Why don't we just buy it from there? But how are we going to ensure that production continues so in this time of need, we can make sure that we have the capability to ramp up and make those productions in CONUS when we need them?
First of all, I think we have to have a business environment that encourages business domestically. I mentioned taxes a while ago. I also talked about when we were addressing vaccines, what we have for FDA procedures and so forth. We need to be safe. We need to manage risk, but we need to be efficient and effective. And I think, frankly, we have lost a lot of business because we have become too bureaucratic, too expensive to do business here. We also, getting back to the point of how do we not let these lines go dry, we are being very careful to make sure that we are spreading our industry expansion dollars many places so that we are not overbuilding capacity in one particular area.
Thank you.
And at this point, I don't think we're close to that.
Thank you.
I have Ms. Cheney next. I know she was here in person. I don't know if she's now remote or she's not here. Okay. Then Mr. Gallagher is the next Republican on the list. Mr. Gallagher, are you still with us? Ms. Stefanik. That's the last Republican member that I had on the list, so I'll go to Mr. Crow. If there are Republican members, if you could let staff know, we'll get you re-added to the list. Mr. Crow is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Lord, for coming in and for the hard work that you and your team have put in under very significantly challenging circumstances. I wanted to just pull on the thread a little bit more of this issue of our ability or the challenges in aggregating demand signals. So to start that, can you just describe for me, how do you define a demand signal? Is that just how much PPE that we need in any given week?
Correct. And so you need to segment who is generating the demand. So obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, the focus was on healthcare facilities. And then we shifted to nursing homes and so forth. So there's all of the medical care, critical care, long-term care is one segment of the demand signal. Then obviously we have our forces from a DoD perspective that we look at, but then we look at the rest of the nation. And if we are going to comply with CDC guidelines and get the nation back to work, that is going to require a certain amount of PPE.
So if I could just interject for a moment here. So would that include, do those signals come from states, municipalities, private industry, other government agencies? Is that all of the kind of places where those signals come from?
And in fact, HHS and FEMA have retained some outside organizations as well, subject matter experts. And again, there's a diversity of thought on this, so one has to rationalize it.
So if they're coming from all these different locations, something that you said earlier kind of stuck out to me, that you said that we're having a really hard time still aggregating that demand signal, and that you saw a present need to create a centralized location to assess all of those signals and to figure out what the need is, which obviously begs the question for me, if we don't have that centralized location and ability to sort through all of that, how do we even, sitting here today, have our arms around or know what it is we need?
What I was trying to convey is that is happening now with HHS and FEMA with the supply chain task force. So that is one of the critical tasks, if you will, that Admiral Polovchek is undertaking and reporting back to the White House task force.
So this task force, in your estimation, is it successfully aggregating those demand signals to the extent that, sitting here right now, the U.S. government knows what's needed and where it's needed?
I believe they do, and that has been a process, not an event. It has resulted, the information has come from many places. There's been a large level of interaction with a lot of state governments. There also has been a lot of work with distributors of medical equipment, for instance, to understand what their total demand signal was prior to the pandemic. And it has come from teams, independent teams looking at it.
And in your estimation, is HHS, FEMA, Supply Chain Task Force, is that the appropriate place, given your very important role in DoD's really important role in managing the defense supply chain? Is it appropriately located within HHS and FEMA?
I think it is because it has been augmented with many people from DoD. And we in ANS talk very frequently. We have people embedded over at the NRCC where most of this has been happening. For instance, I talk probably 3 times a week with Admiral Polovchek. We have Stacey Cummings goes to meetings several times a week. So this is sorted through so that we have what I would call a cadence of communications. Now, this was not the case on March 15th. But since about April 15th, we've started to work into this rhythm. So it's been a process, not an event to aggregate this demand signal, but because we believe we understand it at this point to the degree you can, that is why we can move forward and modernize the strategic national stockpile and know what to
And do you believe that you need any additional authorities, or are you confident that you have both the authorities and an adequate kind of operational picture of the need at this point?
At this point, I believe we do. What we want to make sure that we continue to test is that we have the authorities to work between agencies very quickly using the Economy Act to move money around so we can go and use the expertise where it is and bring it back to the point of need.
Thank you, Secretary Lord. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Torres Small, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Ranking Member. Thank you, Undersecretary Lord. I appreciate the chance to touch base with you today. I want to follow
I don't know that your microphone's on there. The button's in an odd
There we go.
place. There we go.
I wanted to follow up on the conversation that you were having with Congresswoman Davis about vaccine production and distribution. So I understand that vaccine development is being addressed by Operation Warp Speed. However, I have some real concerns that if we wait until the vaccine is developed before we start thinking about the mechanisms to produce and distribute it, we'll lose precious time.
Yeah.
Perfect.
That's not the case. That's not the case.
Well, and
This
so
is
I'm
all
just
being
about to
worked
ask.
in parallel.
Wonderful. I'm so pleased to hear that you are working in parallel. I recognized your comment about the need to have a plan to increase the speed of distribution. So can you tell me what the timeline is for that plan?
That is being worked in Operation Warp Speed right now, and General Perna is probably better to answer that. But I will tell you there has been an enormous amount of work done up to this time. What is being rationalized right now is where the vaccine goes first, and once the prioritized list of who receives it is determined, then that determines where it will go, and then the details can be worked out.
Okay, so to fully understand that, so Operation Warp Speed is not only managing the development of the plan, but the development of the vaccine, but also where it will be delivered. Who is managing the plan for what needs to be manufactured in an effort to distribute the vaccine as quickly as possible?
So it's a combination of Dr. Slawe and General Perna. They are leading it. And what is happening is a series of vaccine companies are being funded to manufacture and then do the finish and fill. And then they are looking at the distribution as well.
So I want to make sure I fully understand that they're working with individual companies for the manufacturing of the specific things that'll be needed for the distribution. So I'm not thinking just the vaccine, but the vials and the needles and the swabs.
Correct.
Okay, and so is DoD, through the Defense Production Act, already starting to identify how to make sure that there aren't those same hiccups in the supply chain that we've seen in testing, for example?
Absolutely. However, what we have done is we have moved away from the Defense Production Act for the health resources because we have found a way to tap into a larger pool of money that HHS has through the CARES Act to do the exact same investment in industry to get that increased capacity and throughput. So yes, that is being worked. That is primarily within Warp Speed right now, working with the Joint PEO under the Army, and they leverage the Joint Acquisition Task Force as well. So yes, there's a large DoD portion of that.
Okay, and can you explain just a little bit more what the value is of going through the CARES Act process as opposed to the Defense Production Act?
Absolutely. Right now, we had $1 billion appropriated through DPA Title III in the CARES Act. We used about $200 million of that for HHS type things, if you will, and then we were able to work with HHS lawyers and DoD lawyers and come up with a mechanism to use the Economy Act to tap into $17 billion that HHS has, so it expands the pool and allows us to use even more money while taking the balance of the $1 billion that came through for DPA Title III and use a portion of that for the defense industrial base.
I appreciate your comments there, and I'm pleased to hear that you're working with Operation Warp Speed to utilize that. And can you explain a little bit more about your role in conjunction, as you mentioned, you are working with them?
They look back to us for acquisition assistance as needed, but what we did was really bifurcate all of our efforts about 3 or 4 weeks ago from what we were doing in terms of just the supply chain task force into one effort looking at the strategic national stockpile and another effort being Operation Warp Speed, which is the vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. So some of the people that were working in JADF on everything went over and were dedicated to Warp Speed. That being said, General Perna and I have regular conversations. Stacy's team in the JADF supports them. So it's a very fluid organization in terms of if there is a need, we will support that instantaneously.
My time has expired.
Thank you. Next up, we have Mr. Brindisi.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I appreciate the department's assistance in helping our communities respond to this pandemic. However, this unprecedented coronavirus pandemic has made it clear that our country's supply chains for critical supplies and materials have vulnerabilities that must be addressed. And we have a lot of work to do to make sure our domestic industrial base is more prepared for situations that might happen in the future. Secretary Ward, I wanted to ask you about domestic non-availability waivers. As you know, under the Buy America Act and the Berry Amendment, the law requires federal agencies to buy certain products domestically, and when domestic items are not available at a reasonable cost or quantity, the department can waive these requirements with the domestic non-availability waivers. Undersecretary Ward, could you briefly describe how frequently the Department of Defense uses domestic non-availability waivers for requirements mandated by the Buy America Act or the Berry Amendment?
I will have to take that for the record and give you actual details on that. I will tell you during this pandemic, one of the biggest challenges we've had in terms of domestic production are textiles, and we have worked on a little bit of policy that allows us, if we cannot produce domestically, to prioritize partial domestic production of it. But we are working with several industry associations to make sure that we ramp up domestic production to the greatest degree possible. We were working early on with Puerto Rico because they had many local shutdowns, and they were critical to us for textile production, and in fact converted over some items. But this is an area of focus for us, and I will get back to you with the numbers.
Okay, so you can get back to us as to how many waivers are typically granted in a year. You could provide that information for maybe the last few years?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And I want to follow up. I appreciate you talking about the concerns regarding rare earth materials and microelectronics. The COVID-19 pandemic has raised many supply chain issues and questions for the future. And I am also particularly concerned about the lack of domestic production of rare earth elements, including indium, germanium, and tin. As you know, the United States was once self-reliant in domestically produced rare earth elements, but over the past 20 years has become 100% reliant on imports, primarily for China. There are important defense and non-defense applications for rare earth elements, including fighter jet engines, guided missile systems, space-based satellites, communication systems, and touchscreens. I appreciate you mentioning that this is a concern. I'm working on some language for the NDAA regarding this, but can you go into any more detail? Do you have a plan to decrease DoD's reliance on China for things like rare earth elements or microelectronics?
Absolutely. From the rare earths, the issue is not so much getting them out of the ground or where they are, it's the processing of them. So we are looking at a variety of options to do this domestically. We are also talking with some of our close partners and allies about having backups of that as well. So this is an area that we are focused on relative to perhaps the reshoring using the Development Finance Corporation. Just had a meeting on that earlier this week. But we've been looking at this for about 2 years. We have a number of ideas. From the microelectronics point of view, I am very concerned at the lack of domestic foundries. We in DoD only use about 1% to 2% of the entire production there. However, having trusted parts is very important to us, and I believe we have the ability to relook at how we work all the way up through the different levels of the supply chain to have more onshore capability, that until we can meet, till we can really identify the technology for zero trust in microelectronics, we need to have some trusted sources. And we actually have quite a bit of activity going on right now to come up with a number of scenarios that we will be bringing forward in the next couple of months of how to do that.
Well, I'll stop there, but I'd like to follow up with you offline on the trusted foundry issue. We have some interesting things happening here in New York State and some new semiconductor facilities that are going up, and I'd love to follow up with you more on that.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I had Mr. Brown. I'm not sure if he's still on the call. Mr. Brown, are you there? Take that as a no. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Lloyd, thank you very much, and for your team. Stacy did a terrific job on the briefing a few days back, and obviously again today. So compliments to you as well as to your team. Beyond that, the issue of the pharmaceuticals has been raised by several of my colleagues. We continue to pursue that along the way. Also, I want to just ask the question. The $750 million of the $1 billion that was allocated was originally going to be for medical issues. It's now been transferred over to the International Development Finance Corporation to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak. What is that? Apparently, it was established in December of 2019. They got $750 million to do something. Is that your responsibility or is that somewhere else? And
A couple different
you
things.
know what they're doing?
I believe I can explain this. We, through the CARES Act, received $1 billion for DPA Title III. We began executing on that for medical industry expansion. What we found was we had a number of defense industrial-based critical needs as well, and worked with our legal teams to find a way to be able to have DoD execute industry expansion for medical resources utilizing the HHS $17 billion appropriation from CARES Act. So we switched over to start using the other pool of money to continue to fund industrial expansion of medical resources, which we continue to do today. We also then started working on defense industrial base industry expansion using DPA Title III. There then was an executive order about 3 weeks ago that enabled the Development Finance Corporation, which typically does international investments for the benefit of our national security, to broaden what they do and use their infrastructure to actually do loans to reshore critical capability for the U.S. As a result of COVID. So what we are doing is taking up to $100 million to provide collateral for the Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, to reshore either health resource types of companies or other national security critical companies. However, that is not being done in isolation. I meet with Adam Bowler, the CEO of DFC, once a week. We sit down and talk about our priorities that we've generated along with HHS and FEMA, as well as our industrial base council priorities. And we are generating a demand signal to DFC to allow them to use their back office, so to speak, to look at potential loans to reshore capability to the U.S. to create jobs and a supply chain here. The DPA Title III money is collateral only that is being used for that.
Secretary, thank you for that explanation, most of which is not understandable because I don't, perhaps none of us really understand who those organizations are. We're talking about a vast amount of money that is flying back and forth around here, all for the good purpose of reshoring. I suspect the Auditor General is going to be very, very busy trying to keep track of all of this, and certainly we need to know where all this money is going and whether it is going to a successful outcome or not. I don't want you to stop attempting to reshore, but it's imperative that we have documentation of where the money is going and for what purpose and for what success, if any. So please keep that in mind, and as you develop that information, please forward it on to our committees. And with that,
Thank you.
Absolutely. I commit to doing that. I'm more than happy to come with Adam Bowler and talk about DFC specifically if needed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Now, I'm not sure who is still here, so I'm just going through the list. If you're not here, you don't have to speak up. Mr. Keating, I have next. He's not here. Mr. Vila. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Loria.
Hi, this is Elaine Luria.
You're recognized
Sorry.
for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Lord, for being here again to talk to us today and for your updates. I had an issue that was brought to my attention by several small businesses here in our community in Hampton Roads, a lot of whom support the Department of Defense. And they brought to my attention that in November of last year, the DLA moved away from the practice of accelerated payments to small business suppliers, and they went from a net 15 to a net 30, and cited shortages in the working capital fund. Under the best of circumstances, these small businesses work on a continuous cash flow. Having payments tied up for an additional 2 weeks is putting an additional strain on them, and especially during the financial burden that they're experiencing during the COVID crisis, this has been exacerbated even more. So my question is, basically, is the department taking any steps to return to the accelerated timeline payments of net 15 for small businesses?
Yes. In fact, although we did move from net 15 to net 30, we are closer usually to the 15 than the 30. However, when we submit our request for the next tranche of funding, if there is tranche 4 here, we have included in that funding to move back to net 15. And that is a need to have working capital funding.
Okay, thank you. And that was going to be my question: is what additionally did you need from Congress to move back to the net 15? My second question is relative to the CARES Act, and specifically Section 3610, which provides much needed relief for the national security contractor workforce, but it's set to expire on September 30th. And I am skeptical that our national security facilities will be back to their full pre-COVID level by September 30th. And I was curious if you could quantify how you foresee this impacting readiness as of October 1st when this runs out, and if we allow that to expire.
We are monitoring to see the health of the defense industrial base. In fact, I get numbers every day through DCMA and DLA. So for instance, we followed 20,000 companies to date. Due to COVID, we've had 960 cumulative closures. We've had 859 cumulative reopenings. So that leaves us with about 101 companies currently closed. And that's about 57 average days closed. So that would be part of what 3610 would look at, is the impact to the employees and so forth as a result of that. We also, as you know, have issues around sickness and not being able to get into facilities, government facilities and so forth. We are writing guidance right now to have claims submitted against that. Although we do have the authorization for 3610, we do not have an appropriation for 3610. So one of the items that we will be submitting on our tranche 4 are funds to help us reimburse the defense industrial base. We continue to monitor on a daily basis to see about the health of the companies. We are optimistic that we see a trend improving in terms of efficiency and ability to operate. Obviously, we have to continue to use all the CDC recommended practices, and we hope we can mitigate any impact due to a second spike of COVID if we do see that in the fall.
Well, thank you. And thanks for quantifying, based off the metrics of the number of companies impacted. Are there any specific areas, weapon systems, impacts operationally that come from specific key companies that may be sole source suppliers of any material that's necessary that rise to your level of being very high concern?
We, two answers to the question. One, there are 3 basic areas that have had the most significant impacts. One of them is aviation, particularly aviation propulsion, and that in large part, as you well know, is due to the implosion of the commercial aviation industry. Secondly, we have seen shipyard impacts for a variety of reasons, although that's coming back pretty well right now. And thirdly, we've seen satellite launch impact again because of the commercial dependence there. Now, we also have seen some critical companies that really were not on our radar screen, so to speak, previously, that had a couple cases, and in one case particularly, a fatality. And there was a very significant impact in shutting down that facility.
I apologize, Ms. Undersecretary. The gentlelady's time has expired. We have other people to get to, so we'll have to move on. Thank you very much. I know Ms. Houlihan is on the line. Ms. Houlihan, you are up now.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you so much for coming today. I want to echo my colleagues' appreciation for your participation.
I think we lost you
Today's
there.
hearings. I also want to thank you for your representation. Can you hear me?
We can. You're breaking
Can
up
you hear
a little.
me?
Yeah, we got you. You're breaking up a little bit, but
Okay.
I think we got you clear.
All right.
Go ahead. I
want to thank you for speaking on rare earth elements at DAA with you all. I did briefly mention Puerto Rico, which has a heritage and history of textile manufacturing, as you mentioned, of pharmaceutical manufacturing. To what degree can you talk about the ability that we might have to be able to incentivize bringing or reshoring manufacturing and production of PPE and pharmaceuticals back to Puerto Rico, if you wouldn't mind talking about that?
We have an effort to reshore both PPE as well as pharmaceuticals, and it comes down to the capability of the companies in Puerto Rico or anywhere else in the U.S. So if there is an interest in doing some of that, as we've already seen from some companies in Puerto Rico relative to making some N95 masks, for instance, they can reach out to our portal. I'll make sure that your office gets all of the information, and we are looking at all kinds of proposals. So we are very interested in speaking with any company anywhere in the U.S. that has an interest and a capability in participating.
Well, you also talked about a way to utilize those dollars. How can we maybe, in the case of an island like Puerto Rico that has been under such duress for so many years at this point in time, and is such an obvious solution for our reshoring needs, how can we be more aggressive in our outreach to that island?
What I would suggest is, number one, that the individuals, the companies on that island that want to participate, reach out to industry organizations. One of the most effective ways that we deal with industry is through industry associations, because it allows the member companies' needs to sort of be echoed and amplified, and it is easier for us to respond to a common reach out from an industry association. So I would really encourage Puerto Rican companies to think about what they have for facilities, equipment, people in terms of skill sets, and reach out to industry associations to understand everything we have available, and we want to hear from them. Likewise, I'll make sure your office has all the information on how to reach out to portals that DoD has.
Thanks, and I just want to companies that a lot of mainland traditional pharmaceutical and domestic manufacturers of apparel had originally worked with factories on Puerto Rico, sure them. So it's not just with the remainder minute of my time, I want to go back to something that Representative Crow talked briefly about, which is, is there one central place where we can look around and find all of our supplies?
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
I think she was asking if there is one central place we can look to find supplies, but I'm sorry, Chrissy, you're breaking up. So
I'm asking. Sure, sir. I apologize. I'm asking whether there's an information system, whether you feel confident of the IT systems that are necessary to be able to monitor and track all of the supplies that we're talking about. A modern IT system, such as Amazon would have.
Distribution.
Yeah. Well. So a couple different things. One, we have a modern system to sell through DLA. In terms of distribution of PPE and so forth, there is a modern system that is being put in by HHS and FEMA for distribution of same.
Thank you. I look forward to learning more about that, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I believe that is all the people that we had who had questions. My staff can let me know if that's not in fact the case. I did just have one follow-up sort of where I started. I know we talked about you're going to get to being able to potentially produce almost a billion masks a year by January, and I forget the number. Where are we at right now in terms of the number of masks that we're producing each month? You may have answered that and I may have missed it.
I don't have that specific, but Stacy may well.
We're going to have to take that for the record to give you specifics. We have them, but I can't give them to you right now.
Because as Mr. Conaway was pointing out, we don't know if we're going to need $1 billion a year come January. I think we have our need right now. So how that ramp looks would be helpful. It's good to know that by January we're going to be there. Where are we going to be in September, for instance, when?
And I can absolutely provide that to you. The one thing I do want to point out is that one of Ms. Lord's comments about how the demand signal is complicated is that there is a medical demand signal and then there's a non-medical demand signal.
Absolutely.
And so I feel very confident that the investments that we've made across the federal government in masks is well worth it and will be used domestically. And I think it's a matter of understanding how they're used now and in the future and when they're used for medical purposes and non-medical purposes.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. There's been a lot of sort of, back and forth about the utility of masks and what type are necessary. But in close working environments, we are not in a close working environment here. We have distance, but if you're, in with a group of people in meatpacking plants and other places, I mean, you can wear one of these masks, but they are not as useful as an N95 mask. So even if we've got the healthcare professionals covered, if you don't have an N95 mask, you do the best you can in a meatpacking plant or in a manufacturing place where you're close to each other. But if they're available, I think there's going to be a pretty big demand signal for those for some time to come. Other than to say thank you, you've been here for almost 2.5 hours now, and I appreciate that. And also to thank the staff. What you see here was not easily put together. We show up and participate, but the technology that had to be wired in, the room that had to be found, all the decisions that were made, the HASC staff set all of this up. And this is also very helpful practice for us for when we come in here and try to mark up our bill. So staff did incredible work on this, and I want to publicly thank them for that work. With that, I'll yield to Mr. Thornberry for any closing remarks he might have.
Mr. Chairman, I just echo those comments, and again, thank Undersecretary Lord for being here.
Thank you. And with that, we are adjourned.